Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Plato was born sometime between 428 and 423 BC, and he died either in 347 or 348 BC, so some 350 to 400 years before Jesus. We have this gentleman named Plato. Plato was born in Athens to a distinguished family, so he had the benefit of good education. His name actually wasn't Plato, though. Plato is his nickname. His name was Aristocles. But where did he get the nickname? His wrestling coach nicknamed him Platon, which is the Greek word for broad. So you can imagine that Plato must have been a little broad-shouldered because his wrestling coach gave him the nickname Broad. Hey, Brody. And that name obviously stuck. That from that time on, Aristocles, as happens with many people, had a nickname from that time on and is known in all eternity now by his nickname. He was likely acquainted with Socrates from his youth, so we know that Plato was a student of Socrates, was likely acquainted with him from his youth, was biased against democracy, likely because he saw what democracy did to Socrates, right? What happened with Socrates? He was condemned to death for corrupting youth. Was he corrupting youth? Right? So Plato had bad experience with democracy and how it is that if you put certain people in charge, they don't always make the best decisions. He originally intended to be a politician, but after Socrates' death in 400 BC, you can imagine how disgusted he might have been with those who were in power. Plato was present at Socrates' trial and encouraged Socrates to increase his self-imposed fine from 1 to 30 minae. So Plato was there at the trial and was suggested, they've sentenced you to death. It's time for you to suggest something. Socrates probably said, well, I'm thinking of suggesting 1 mina. 1 mina? Like they're going to take that? They're going to totally throw the book at you. So at least suggest 30. Plato was ill and presumably unable to be present at Socrates' death, so there's no record of Plato being present at the death in the same way there is of him being present at the trial. At age 40, he visited Italy and Sicily. There he incited the anger of Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse, who did what? Who sold Plato into slavery. Don't make rulers mad. Right? It can't end well. In his case, he was sold into slavery and was later ransomed by Anisarus of Cyrene in North Africa, and returned to Athens, where he founded the Academy. So how interesting. Socrates didn't have a school. Plato, though, is going to found a school, which is called the Academy. Not to be confused with the sports gear store, right? Founded the Academy, which Father Fred Copleston says was the first European university of sorts, simply meaning they were teaching various subjects at the Academy to those who wanted to come and listen. Subjects included math, astronomy, harmonics, science. Harmonics, do you remember from last class? Harmonics, the ancients had this insight of how it was that music was math. The Pythagoreans, right? Look at a guitar. It's simply spaces on the handle of an instrument. And if you put your finger on one, it makes one noise. If you put your finger on another, it makes another noise. It's all mathematical. So harmonics then was the study of exactly that, of music and of harmony. We have several of Plato's popular works. We refer to them as his dialogues. But we don't have any of his lectures. How interesting. It's just the opposite with Aristotle. Aristotle, we have all of his lectures, but none of his works. With Plato, we have all of his works, but none of his lectures. So here he was lecturing in the Academy all day long, and we don't have any of those lectures from the Academy. All we have are the books that were published. There are lots of books. We can go through the list of them. We presume we have all of Plato's published dialogues. Why? because there's no reference to works in later antiquity that we don't have. There's no work that says, in Plato's work, such and such, we find this phrase. Anytime that there's a phrase like that, we have that book that was written by Plato. There's no book that's mentioned that we have not found, that we don't have. There are 36 dialogues. Are they all from Plato? We figure that of those 36, that 6 are spurious, simply meaning that 6 have his name, but weren't written by him. So 6 are spurious, that were not written by Plato. 6 are authentic until proven spurious, meaning we're not sure that they're authentic, we're going to presume that they are until proven otherwise. And that leaves 24 then that we presume to be authentic, that we presume to be written by Plato. So that's 24 that we know he wrote, 6 more that we say that he wrote until someone proves us differently. That's 30 different books, some of them lengthy, written by Plato. We divide them into different periods. Here are 4 different periods. Those from the Socratic period are first. The ones that are talking about Socrates, that were written earliest. We talked about how it was that at first Plato just wrote about Socrates, and then afterward he would branch out and start writing other works with his own thoughts. But at first Plato was just writing about Socrates. What are some of those works? His Apology, which is the story of Socrates' defense at his trial. So the reason that I put both the title of the work and a short definition is so that, based on your interests, you can go ahead and look some of these up. If you're interested in reading about Socrates' defense at his trial, which book should you read? The Apology. Crito. Crito is the story of how it is that despite an unjust condemnation, Socrates is a good citizen willing to give up his life in obedience to the laws of the state. He's unjustly condemned, but he is willing to give up his life in obedience to the state. The state has these laws, the state has sentenced him to death, so he will give up his life. In that book, that dialogue, Crito and others provide him money and suggest that he escape. Will he do it? Nope. Going to stand by his principles. The Euthyphron. In the Euthyphron, it's on the nature of piety. Why? Because what was Socrates on trial for? For impiety, for not on worshiping the gods and for introducing other practices. So it's a book on piety. Laches is a book on courage, right? Trying to figure out what courage is. Here we have Socrates standing trial, ready to go to death. Courage. Aeon is a work against poets and rhapsodists. Let's save that for now. We'll come back in a moment to why it is that Plato didn't like poets. We seem to esteem poets. Plato didn't have such a high estimation of poets. We'll see why in a moment. Protagoras, how it is that virtue is knowledge. Where did he get that thought from? Socrates. That's probably a thought that he really received from Socrates. So virtue is knowledge, and virtue can be taught. Charmides is on temperance. The Republic is on justice. After those works, we see various works that were written during the transition period. So those first works were based mostly on Socrates' dialogues, but now we have this transition period where Plato is discovering his own thoughts and opinions. Works like Gorgias. Gorgias talks about the practical politician, the rights of the stronger versus the philosopher, justice at all costs, that's Gorgias. Meno, virtue can be taught. So that's the theme that we already saw up above in Protagoras. It's simply that now it's sort of like a correction in light of this ideal theory that Plato was expounding. Euthydemus was against the logical fallacies of the Sophists. So how interesting that the Sophists of whom we spoke in the last class, they were coming with all these fallacious arguments to be able to win court cases. But just because you're winning doesn't mean that you're right or that it's true. Hippias I, the first book of Hippias is on the beautiful, on the nature of beauty. What is beautiful? How we know the beautiful in light of beauty with capital B. Second dialogue with Hippias. Is it better to do wrong voluntarily or involuntarily? If you're going to do something wrong, is it better to do it on purpose or to do it accidentally? Cratylus is on the theory of language. Menexenus is a parody on rhetoric. After that, we have the period of Plato's works from his maturity. Now that he's written his books on Socrates, now that he's coming into his own thoughts, now we're seeing some real works of mature thought of his own. The Symposium, all earthly beauty is a shadow of true beauty. How do we know what's beautiful here on earth? It's just a shadow of this idea or form of beauty. This idea of beauty to which the soul aspires by the higher Eros. Have we seen that word before? Eros, there are different types of love. We talked about this during our first class. There's agape, which is the highest form of love. There's philia. Philia is where we get the word philosophy. It's more a brotherly or a familial type of love. But the lowest form of love is eros. The English word erotic comes from it. So what is eros? Eros is the earnest desire for the possession of happiness and that which is good. The desire to procreate and have children, that's the desire for what is good. The earnest desire for possession of happiness and that which is good is eros. The higher eros is what is that by which the soul aspires to beauty. Phaedo, pronounced like the dog. Phaedo is a book on ideas, the forms and ideas, and also on immortality, how it is that the soul outlives the body. In this dualism of soul and body, where should we focus? On the soul. Why? Because the soul is immortal. The body is mortal, the body dies. Does the soul die? The soul doesn't die. Republic is a work on the state. We'll be exploring lots of ideas that he had in the Republic about how we should organize our government and organize our society. Phaedrus is on the nature of love and the possibility of philosophic rhetoric. And then after that we have 9 works actually that come from Plato's old age. So now that he's older, what are some of the works? We have Phaedrus, which is on the fact how it is that knowledge is not sense perception. Be careful, because your senses can deceive you. Just because you see something or hear something doesn't mean that that's true knowledge. Parmenides, named after the early philosopher, is a defense of Plato's ideal theory. Sophists, that deals with the theory of ideas, the theory of the forms. We'll get back to that in a moment, how it is that these things exist outside of us in this metaphysical realm. Politicus, known by its English name, the statesman, is on the legal state, how the legal state is makeshift, but the true ruler is the knower. You want to be a ruler? What do you have to be? A knower. To work on the philosopher king. Who should be ruling over us? The knower. Philebus is the relationship of pleasure to the good, so it's the relationship between the pleasurable and the good. Timaeus has to do with natural science, and it's interesting because in Timaeus we find this is a work from his old age. We find an idea there for the first time of this demiurge that we'll come back to. How was the earth created? The earth was created through the demiurge, and that's an idea that we get actually from his old age, not from any of his earlier works. Critias deals with the ideal agrarian state, contrasted with imperialistic sea power. They use the name Atlantis. How interesting. I think we've heard that name before, for the imperialistic sea power. And the last 2 works, Laws and Euthydemus, have simply to do with the old Plato now, simply revising his ideas, being a bit more realistic, like St. Paul, right? The more experience that we get in life, the older we get, the wiser we get. So he was simply revising the utopianism that he had previously set forth in his work, The Republic.